Hi everyone, my name is Anabelle Caso, and today I'll be discussing the results of my 2021 Concordia Undergraduate Student Research Award. For my project, I transliterated and translated Book 19 of the Atharvaveda Paippalāda, and I compared this text to the Atharvaveda Shaunaka. My plan today is to first discuss some relevant background about these two texts, then I'll review the methodology that I used to complete this project, and at this point I'll discuss my results and the implications of my results, particularly in terms of the archaic nature of both of these texts. So in terms of background, the Atharvaveda Paippalāda is one of two Atharvaveda texts, the other being the Atharvaveda Shaunaka. Scholars have proposed that the Atharvaveda was compiled between 1200 and 1000 BCE. The Atharvaveda is the fourth of four Sanskrit Vedas, which are religious texts from the ancient Indian tradition. If you are not a historical linguist or are unfamiliar with Vedic literature, you've probably still heard of the first Veda, which is called the Rig Veda. So these four religious texts are written in Vedic Sanskrit, which is the oldest attested form of the Sanskrit language. Vedic Sanskrit is an important language in Indo-European studies because it preserves many archaisms from Proto-Indo-European, a reconstructed language from which all Indo-European languages descend, including Indo-Iranian. Until relatively recently, only the Atharvaveda Shaunaka was known to be preserved. In 1957, a well-preserved version of the Atharvaveda Paippalāda was discovered, and some of the books still lack an analysis and translation into English. So for my project, I focused on Book 19 of the Atharvaveda Paippalāda, a book which contains 55 hymns and approximately 15 mantras per hymn. I say approximately because there's 2 or 3 that I've looked at so far that contain about 16 mantras. This project required me to transliterate the Atharvaveda Paippalāda from the Devanagari script and then translate it into English. In order to do this, I first compared my transliteration to the Birchbark transliteration available on the Titus website, and then I compared my translation to Whitney's translation of the Atharvaveda Shaunaka. I ended up modeling a majority of my translations off of Whitney's translation of the Shaunaka, except at points at which I kind of disagreed with his translation. In doing this, I was able to conduct a grammatical analysis between the Atharvaveda Paippalāda and Whitney's translation of the Atharvaveda Shaunaka. There were a couple of interesting differences, primarily in morphology, but there was some cool stuff in the way of orthography and potentially phonology. I'll mention that at the end. To start with a couple obvious observations about the archaic nature of the Atharvaveda Shaunaka and the Atharvaveda Paippalāda, we see here that first-person plural verbs can contain an ending masi, which is an archaic form of the first-person plural that later becomes mas in the classical language. In these two lines in particular, we have the first-person plural form of vish, meaning to enter in the Paippalāda, and we see the first-person plural of ni, to lead, in the Shaunaka. In terms of nominal morphology, we can see an archaic form of the masculine accusative plural ending in the Atharvaveda Paippalāda, shown here on the slide. This corresponds to the ending on in the later classical language. The archaic forms of certain words are also really prevalent in the Atharvaveda Paippalāda, including this pantha, path. It's an older form of the strong stem of this word for path. Speaking more about the differences between these two texts, it's a pretty common occurrence that the Atharvaveda Paippalāda will use enclitic plural first-person pronouns, where the Atharvaveda Shaunaka will use enclitic singular first-person pronouns. Here we have two instances of a first-person plural enclitic pronoun appearing where a first-person singular enclitic pronoun appears in the Atharvaveda Shaunaka. There's lots of evidence for this, including what you see on this slide here. We see the exact same discrepancies. Another interesting thing came in the form of this adverb ga, surely or indeed, that appears in the Atharvaveda Paippalāda. I find it kind of interesting that the Shaunaka just has ha, so assuming these two particles develop in parallel, and assuming that the ha particle is more frequent in the classical language as compared to the ga particle, which to my knowledge seems true, this could be kind of interesting evidence for the Atharvaveda Shaunaka having innovations, where the Atharvaveda Paippalāda does not have those same innovations. This also could mean nothing, but I am under the impression that there are scholars who study the Atharvaveda Paippalāda who believe that it's older than the Shaunaka, and if this is the case, I wonder if this could lend support for that. Now turning to some other interesting differences, the Atharvaveda Paippalāda demonstrates instances of a b occurring where the Atharvaveda Shaunaka lacks a b, and it also demonstrates instances of a v occurring where a b appears in the Atharvaveda Shaunaka. There's a couple reasons why this is kind of interesting to me. First of all, discrepancies between b and v characters in the Devanagari script, as you can see on the slide, are very common. The only difference between the two is that line through the loop in the b. On the level of orthography, it has been suggested that V's are more common in the later language, so we can imagine a situation, because the character is comparatively more simple than the B, scribes might have failed to write that additional line in the B character, and with time this mistake is just adapted by learners into the spelling of certain words. Alternatively, on a phonological level, the confusion between a B, a labial stop, and a V, a weaker labiodental fricative, is not totally unheard of. In fact, changes like this are pretty common. Again, cross-linguistically, we do see a lot of lenition, especially in comparison to fortition. So this does align with what we know about developments in language in general. It's really important to note in the two preceding explanations I just provided, we're relying on some assumption that one text precedes the other, such that one can demonstrate innovations or the result of diachronic change. However, there is a hypothesis that's prevalent in Indo-Iranian studies in which there was some sort of surface form of v that was pronounced like a voice labial fricative. So if this is the case, we don't need to make an assumption that one text predates the other, and instead we can assume that they were developed in parallel, and we have a phonological explanation that explains the existence of b and v characters in the Devanagari script between each text. Statistically speaking, one text didn't have proportionally more v's where the other had buzz, and vice versa. It's pretty evenly split between the Paippalāda and the Shaunaka, the presence of a v where the other has a b, or the presence of a b where the other has a v. So it seems like this explanation, which can take into account that assumption of parallel development, is the most satisfying explanation. Again, there are Paippalāda scholars who believe it is the older of the two texts. However, to my knowledge, there's not like an overwhelming amount of evidence of that. So an explanation like this that doesn't require such an assumption seems better. I would feel bad not mentioning here that Mark Hale is totally responsible for my presenting this final hypothesis to you all. Initially, when I saw this data, it was very hard not to form an orthographic hypothesis, or a hypothesis that surrounds, at the very least, sound change in the Saussurean sense, by which I mean like over time. So thank you, Dr. Hale. Quickly, before I go, I would like to point out that there are some discrepancies in R and L sounds between the Atharvaveda Paippalāda and an older birch bark transliteration of the Atharvaveda Paippalāda that's available on Titus. So the Paippalāda text was composed in the Kuru region of northwestern India. Instances of R and L merger to L are more common in Eastern dialects of Indic languages, and instances of R and L merger to R are more common in Western dialects of Indic languages. The original distinction between R and L is preserved in middle regions. I don't know whether the discrepancies between R and L could lend support for the conclusion that the Paippalāda text was composed in a region that is more central to the Indian subcontinent, or that the Paippalāda version that I worked on over the summer is older or more Western than a newer or more Eastern Titus Birchbark version. There's really not enough data to draw any one conclusion from, but it does seem coherent to me to say that two versions of the Paippalāda from the Kuru region, which is central to the Indian subcontinent, having both an R and an L, aligns with our understanding of R and L merger in general. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd also like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Mark Hale, without whom this project would not have been possible, although I should point out that all mistakes are entirely my own. So thank you again.